Welcome to the Mind-Gut Conversation, your go-to podcast for exploring cutting-edge ideas in optimal health and the fascinating science of mind-gut microbiome interactions. I'm your host, Emeran. Here we bring together thought leaders, groundbreaking researchers, and innovative practitioners to share insights that can transform the way you understand your body, mind, and overall well-being. Whether you're a health enthusiast, a curious learner, or a professional in the field, this podcast is your gateway to unlocking the secrets of the mind-gut connection. So settle in, open your mind, and join us as we journey into the science and stories shaping. Today, I have the great pleasure to speak to Dr. Annie Fenn, founder of the Brain Health Kitchen, the only cooking school of its kind focused exclusively on brain health and helping people prevent cognitive decline through food and lifestyle. Dr. Fenn is a board-certified OBGYN, and after 20 years of seeing patients, she traded in her stethoscope for an apron to pursue her passion for the culinary arts. But according to Dr. Fenn, it was her mother's diagnosis with dementia that helped her to find her path and her new calling, one that enabled her not only help her mother, but also create significant and meaningful impact for others. Dr. Fenn published the Brain Health Kitchen cookbook in 2023 with the subtitle Preventing Alzheimer's Disease Through Food. This book not only contains 100 brain healthy recipes, but is the most detailed and informative diet book for anybody trying to prevent early cognitive decline. Dr. Fenn lives in Jackson, Wyoming, and she shares recipes and brain health content twice weekly on her popular newsletter, brainhealthkitchensubstack.com, and on Instagram at brainhealthkitchen. Welcome to the show, Annie. Again, we've talked in the past several occasions, and I've been an avid reader of your cookbook, which I want to show you here again.
Well, thanks for having me, Emeran. It's always good to be here.
Yeah, so I've sort of been following your travels through Italy and the workshops you've been giving there, and it's great that you have the time, to go over a few questions. I was going to start with a few general questions about the Mediterranean diet. Obviously, that will be the main topic overall, and then I'm going to ask you a few specific questions about parts in your sections in your book and specific foods. So the one thing that's always intrigued me is the current dietary patterns in different provinces of Italy that I've experienced going there almost every year, different areas. They vary widely from north to south and from east to west. Yet when you look up the life expectancy in these different regions, they're about the same. And so, from the place that you were recently in Sicily to Emilia-Romagna, or northern Italy, obviously the Dolomite area is even more different. What do you think? How can you explain this? That people eat very different things, composition and yeah, how can you explain that despite all the talk that we have about health span and increasing longevity and the health benefits of diets? How can you explain this?
Well, I don't know if I have all the answers, but I will tell you that I am fascinated by this aspect of the Mediterranean dietary pattern. I have also observed, that the cuisines, when you go from, say, northern Italy to Sardinia to Sicily to Puglia to Tuscany, are all very different. They're regional. Sometimes they're hyper regional. Like there are parts of Sicily where, you go 50 miles away and they may never even heard of certain foods that you were eating on the coast. That's certainly true in isolated areas like the mountains of Sardinia. They eat completely different than on the coast, even though it's a very short drive away. And I think that the difference lies in they're all following a dietary pattern that has common threads.
And what are
Okay.
these? What are these?
Yes. Number one is the way that food fits into their lives. Everyone I know, especially the elders I talk to in Italy, in particular, where I have the most experience, everyone has some tie to the food or the land. Everybody grows something, or everybody harvests olives, or helps their friend harvest olives, or has something to do with the food culture. They still have a very strong sense of their food culture and a lot of pride in it. And so I believe that that falls over into their daily life. And the other thing that as a tourist, a lot of people may not realize that no matter where you are in Italy, Italians don't really eat the food that we see in restaurants there. The
Mm.
restaurants are mostly catering to tourists. There's larger portions of pasta than Italians would eat at home. Italians are eating primarily vegetables, a lot of legumes, a lot of nuts and seeds, fish and seafood, small portions of meat. It's really totally different than you would get the impression of if you went to a restaurant in most parts of Italy.
Does this also have to do with with economic reasons? Because I mean, obviously, some of the what we consider now unhealthy foods, like daily steaks and other meats are more expensive. I mean, this was clearly something when the Mediterranean diet concept started with observations in Crete where people didn't have enough money to eat a lot of meat. So, but is that
Yeah,
still
I
today?
think there is a sentiment of frugality throughout the Mediterranean eating. There's a sentiment that large portions of meat are just sort of extravagant and not necessary, reserved for special occasions like feast days. And I know my grandparents were that way. They emigrated from central Sicily, and the more time they spent in America, the more meat crept into their diet because it became sort of sort of a way to express their newfound affluence
Mhm, mhm.
in the United States. But back in the old country, they were following the cucina povera, the poor people's food, which is the heart of the Mediterranean diet. And actually, what's really good for us, from a gut and brain health and longevity standpoint.
Which is interesting. Sort of a related question. So the modern dietary patterns in Italy, and you already differentiate between what you eat in a restaurant and what you would eat at home, are very different from the traditional Mediterranean diet as described by Ansel Keys from his observations on the Greek islands. And yet some of the health benefits described by him are still present. So for cardiovascular disease, I mean, he's been kind of a controversial person. I'm not exactly sure why he's become controversial, but I still think the key observations, hold today. Um,
I just think everything is controversial now in nutrition,
yeah, yeah. So that's,
even like Ansel Keys' good work. Yeah.
but so I think you mentioned this a little bit. So these modern dietary, this transformation. So I mean, we had an interesting experience recently this summer um, in Parma and Piacenza, where went to speak at meetings, and it was hard to find anything else besides ham, uh, parmesan, parmesan cheese, and pasta, even in the restaurants. Very few dishes with vegetables and no salad unless you specifically ask for it. That was kind of one of the most amazing experiences that even though, Parma is sort of a UNESCO heritage site for nutrition, um, is this, I mean, how do you see this when you talk about, I mean, do you talk about the Mediterranean diet or do you talk about the Sicilian diet or the Tuscany diet?
Well, I'm fascinated by all the different variations, especially like the Sardinian diet in the blue zones where I host retreats and I've traveled to the really small towns that host the most centenarian men in the world. But I think it's good to remember that the Mediterranean diet is also a lifestyle.
Mm.
And so, one of the commonalities that you see throughout the country and throughout the Mediterranean area is that it's not just the food that they eat, it's their approach to food, it's the movement before and after the food. It's it's how the food touches their life, how they share it, the importance of it, sitting around a table. Certainly there is fast food in Italy and there's junk food. Even in the smallest village in Sardinia, you can find junk food, sadly. But a lot of these areas are very protective about keeping that food out so that they can maintain their traditional ways. So there's a pride, in those traditional ways. There's a pride in maintaining the lifestyle and their food roots. So I think that Parma might be an outlier when it comes to this type of food. I had thought about doing a brain health retreat in that area. And my collaborator in Italy, who does retreats there, said, I don't know if you're going to find a lot of brain healthy food in this area. But it's also important to remember the food is not only regional, it's hyper seasonal. So depending on when you are there, if you're in the spring, you're going to eat a completely different dietary pattern than if you're there in the fall and the winter.
Do you think, I mean, I don't know if there's a good answer for this. I mean, do you think that seasonality plays a role in health benefits? I mean, that you don't eat the same thing all year round, but I mean, I could think of, multiple reasons. It sort of challenges your microbiome every time you switch the dietary pattern, which could be a good thing. And but I mean, do you know of any evidence that that is actually contributes to the health benefits to have the seasonal variation, or is it more the connectedness to the season? I mean, having
I don't have any evidence, but my gut feeling, and I feel like yours as well, being, so knowledgeable in the gut microbiome, is that, our bodies like to see a wide diversity of foods. And that is good for health and longevity. It's good for brain health because when you're eating a wide diversity of foods, you're hitting all the brain healthy food groups and you're hitting all these essential brain health nutrients that you don't get if you have a restricted diet. When I think of the hyper seasonality of the food, I'm thinking of food that is really fresh, really nutrient dense, consumed close to its source and like where I live in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, in the winter, my salad greens might travel 1,000 miles. They are simply not the same salad greens as when they came out of the ground in California.
Mhm.
And, we have local greenhouses and things like that, of course, but a lot of our food is imported. And what I'm finding in Italy is that people are constantly reaching for these foods that are of the moment. For example, basil in Sicily. Basil is a thing, the type of basil that we think of, that we would get at the grocery store. Of course, there's many varieties of basil. Basil is really only a thing in June and July. You literally can't find it in the markets or the grocery store in the fall because it's over.
Yeah, I mean, to maintain this discipline and go against this thing, we can't have anything from everywhere in the world. I mean, a lot of the stuff that comes here, even in California in the winter, like grapes come from Chile, like
Mm.
or Peru or whatever.
It's
Just
true. If you want to have a grape, you have to get it that has accrued all these food miles. The um the food is more nutrient dense, but also because a lot of it is sourced locally, it's also more accessible to people and more affordable. Like everyone has access to good, healthy, nutritious, fresh food in Italy. Everybody, whether you live in the city or the country, you walk home from the train in the city and you're going to pass 3 or 4 markets on your way home. And all of these markets have seasonal produce that are not grown far away, and everybody has access to it. Everyone can afford it. I think it's a huge difference between the US and Italy.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I had a recent experience also like in the Dolomite area of Italy, visiting a friend of mine, Norbert Niederkofler, who is a 3 Michelin star chef, and his philosophy is cook the mountain. And he was a Michelin star chef in the past, where he imported. He always talks about it, imported fish from Alaska and all parts of the world, and tuna from Japan, and then at some point he had this insight. He just wants to only use ingredients locally that are available without transport. And
Mhm.
it's kind of remarkable what he has done. So in wintertime, there's a lot of fermented foods now because he can't get a
Mhm.
lot of these vegetables and things. So he starts fermenting in the summer, and then actually visiting his restaurant, he showed us this whole room with all these fermented foods stored there. You know, it's an interesting concept, difficult to maintain because people are so spoiled with this
Mhm.
ubiquity of any kind of food all the time. But it may be there may be something another big reason for the health benefit.
And I think the fermented food is such an interesting aspect of these traditional diets, not just the Mediterranean dietary pattern, but the Latin American dietary pattern, the Asian American dietary pattern. They all have some aspect of fermented food. And we know that fermenting food increases probiotic cultures, right? Certain microbes, grow that may be beneficial for our health. But it also extends the growing season.
Mm.
And so it gives you the ability to eat your local food for longer. And I was so impressed by the gut microbiome data in relation to its link to helping with cultivating healthy brain health, that I added fermented food to my brain food pyramid. And that
Mhm.
was based on a study that came out of Stanford a couple years ago looking
Yeah,
at
yeah.
the impact of fermented food or fiber-rich food. And they both improved both the diversity of the gut microbiome and the colony counts. But fermented food actually jump-started the process.
Yeah,
So,
which was unexpected for the investigators. You know, I mean, they did
uh-huh.
not expect that because they're sort of um, yeah, and I mean, the interesting thing about fermented foods, you know, humans did this like at least 10,000, started at least 10,000 years ago, so our bodies had the time to adapt this genetically. So it takes about 10,000 years before our genes adapt to major changes. And so this is just the time period where so our ancestors didn't produce these fermented foods for health benefits. They produced it exclusively for, being able to have these foods available when they traveled or
Yeah.
during different seasons.
Survival.
Yeah,
Yeah. Having food to eat. Yeah. And I think sometimes it can be a difficult adaptation for the modern palate. You have to start to, introduce these foods slowly if you're not used to them, or else they might taste strange to you. But, just like when we were raising kids, it's not like you're going to let your kids get away with not liking something the first time that they try it.
yeah, yeah,
You have to keep reintroducing this food to a baby or a young child until their taste buds start to,
yeah.
be open to it. It's the same thing with adults. It takes us at least 21 days of introducing a new food. So I really like to encourage people to embrace different fermented foods that they may be ignoring because there's so many health benefits.
Does the Mediterranean diet contain traditional fermented foods, or is this like a new addition to it?
I've thought about this a lot. I'm not seeing a lot of fermented vegetables, like things like you would think of like kimchi or sauerkraut, except in some of the mountain cultures in Italy. I've seen that. But there is a lot of fermented dairy in Italy, which
Mhm.
I think is very interesting. And there's a lot of artisanal cheeses that are made very old-fashioned ways, long fermented. They're racking up probiotics as they age. And even though cheese is considered a source of saturated fat in the diet, which we try to limit in a brain healthy diet, especially, it's also a rich source of these probiotics. So you have to wonder when you look at, say, the Sardinian diet, people in Sardinia eat cheese breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Hmm.
It's
Interesting.
it's a huge part of their diet. Cheese and bread are a huge component of their diet, making up to about half of their calories are consumed. And yet, it's paradox, right? We think of carbs like bread and things like cheese as not being very good for us, but these are very high quality fermented products made the old-fashioned way, and they're eaten in small amounts. But I think that there's something there that this is the way that they are consuming the fermented foods that are local to them.
Yeah, I mean, there's also this term, the French. So you said the Sardinian paradox, but there's also this term, the French paradox, the same situation, consuming lots of cheese in small amounts and a lot of bread with the cheese. So it's
Mm.
definitely not as simple as I think, many of the modern food gurus are recommending.
It's
To me.
not as simple, and it's really hard to put in a pyramid or in a guideline because, like we were saying, it's not just a diet, it's a lifestyle. It has to do with all of these things we've been talking about. And it's particular from region to region. One of the things in Sardinia that really strikes me is how often people socialize in a day. On
Mhm.
average, Sardinian men, especially the ones that are known for the longevity, they socialize for 5 hours a day.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's
And when you're in a small town in Sardinia, when the church bell rings 5 o'clock, you see hundreds of men coming out of their homes, walking down like these steep streets to the local bar, meeting up with their friends, laughing, telling stories for hours.
wow.
You know, Sometimes they're smoking, they're having a little glass of wine. But I have to think that this community, this laughter, this tradition, and just like this sense of belonging has a lot to do with how well they age.
Yeah, this concept, and this is sort of one of my favorite concepts, this idea of interconnectedness, which is like many of the topics that we've talked about now, connectedness to the seasons, to the celebrating the seasons, connectedness to the religion. I mean, most Italians are, fairly traditionally religious, um, connectedness to the soil, to the food, to each other. I mean, this is really almost like a theme that goes through all the dimensions. And connectedness is something, it's a fundamental principle of life that we have, in some ways, in many ways, tried to ignore or abolished in our linear Western worldview, that we think everything is simple from, cause and effect, and from one cause to one effect. Um, that's something that's evolving, I think, fairly rapidly. And you only have to look at cultures like in the Mediterranean basin. It's probably not limited to Italy. It's probably in the other Mediterranean countries similarly. Um, and I think what we're experiencing in the US now, this, what's been called the endemic of loneliness, is going in the opposite direction. People are disconnected from their roots, disconnected from their religion. Um, so I think there's a larger thing going on that, explains some of the differences that, um,
I totally agree. And, to be a healthy eater in the US, you have to be a little bit of an outlier. You have
yeah.
to be a little squeaky wheel. You have to be the person at the restaurant asking what kind of oil is in the salad dressing. And it's not great for most people. You actually have to make an effort. But like, let's say if you lived in a small town on the coast of Sicily, you're actually living in a culture that supports your healthy choices.
Mhm.
And your neighbors are doing it too. And your family is doing this, and your friends are doing this. This is what we eat in the spring. This is what we eat in the summer. This is how we put up food for the winter. So that sense of commonality, I think, must be very comforting. It's like having a culture that just wraps its arms around you, so you don't have to be so independent and such an outlier. In the United States, we're very independent. We love being independent, right? And I think that sometimes is not good for our health in some ways, because it feeds into this, we have to forge our own food culture. That's why we've got all these nutrition camps, these like nutrition religions that you see on social media, people battling about whether you should eat all meat or all vegetables. And, obviously,
Because, yeah, because there's no basis to start from, so people come up with these new ideas, um,
yeah.
and often, I mean, this is always something that bothers me. I mean, like before I published my book, I mean, I didn't even know what social media were, and then you sort of get sucked into it because you want to promote you, your publication. And then all of a sudden you realize how crazy that world is, where the number of followers, and email addresses count more than any scientific or
Yeah.
experiential knowledge. It's
Yeah, it's really a shame. And that's one reason why I started doing brain health retreats, honestly. People are really confused about nutrition. I write about how to eat, I write recipes. I lay out all the science in my book. I write on my newsletter about this every single week. And yet people are still kind of confused about like, how do I make this work for me? And I feel like the best way to do that is to take them to Costa Rica or take them to Italy and put them in a situation where they can be immersed in this Mediterranean lifestyle and see for themselves how people live, how they behave, the importance of the food culture. Basically we go on foodie field trips every single day, meet olive oil purveyors, meet, people that raise the meat, people that make the cheese, and get a sense for how important that food culture is to them and how hard they're trying to preserve it. And then when you have that whole context of what the Mediterranean diet and lifestyle really is, you can take that back home and figure out how you're going to fit that into your own life. Because it's very doable. I think it helps have a frame of reference.
So do you find that the participants in your workshops, I mean, do you have follow-ups with them? Do they actually then incorporate this into their lives when they're back in the US?
Yes, yes. I mean, one thing that I love about my brain health retreats is the groups are pretty small. I'm usually between 12 and 20 people. And by the end of the week, we all become really good friends. And we have a WhatsApp chat that keeps going. I have stayed in contact with pretty much every single person that's been on a retreat with me. They come to me for ongoing advice and support. And I love hearing from them and hearing what they're doing with their lives. So I'm getting a lot of like real life feedback from these people that doing something that can actually be life changing. Just figuring out how do you want to eat? How do you want to adapt this to your life? And being Mediterranean may not fit with someone's, life goals. Like if I grew up in an African American home, being told that I should eat a Mediterranean diet all of a sudden is just, not true to my food roots. But the African American heritage diet is very similar to the Mediterranean diet when you look at the pyramids. They
Mhm.
have the same proportion of leafy greens and vegetables and nuts and seeds, fish and seafood, smaller amounts of meats and sweets and refined products. All of these heritage diets have similar aspects to the Mediterranean diet. So the point is not to like turn everyone into, a copycat of an Italian person. It makes sense for me because that's my heritage.
Yeah.
But like to take that and then adapt it to what makes sense for one's own food roots. Because I think that's how you make it sustainable. It's how
Yeah,
you
and I
make it.
like this, I mean, I like this way that you create these pyramids for everything, for drinks, for, vegetables, for because it's different from saying, here are good and here are bad things. Like you give people the whole choice, and just
Mhm.
eat some things in moderation or minimize them, whereas others you increase. And that these patterns are applicable, as you said, to other cultures. I mean, even in Asia, traditional Asian cuisine, fits into many of these pyramids as well. It's just, I mean, the Mediterranean diet has gotten a lot of attention because most of the research has been done with the Mediterranean diet, even though
Yeah.
um, it's actually not that easy. So from the studies that we're doing at our center at UCLA, and where we try to, you know, um, correlate dietary patterns with microbial features, composition, function, and also with brain parameters, like structure and function and connectivity. It's not that easy to obtain an accurate dietary information. So I've tried all kinds of
Oh, true.
ways of doing this, and
Absolutely.
so we've come to the conclusion either when there's evidence that the traditional food frequency questionnaires are essentially useless because if you bring somebody into the hospital and lock them up for a week, they will eat something totally, and they will eat totally different from what they tell you on
Mhm.
these questionnaires. So
It's very
um,
hard to study nutrition. It's extremely challenging. And some studies do it well by controlling for the nutrition input. But if any, like I'm a participant in a brain health study, and I had to do a food frequency questionnaire. And one of the questions was going back 20 years, like what I used to eat on a daily basis. Like how accurate could that be? I mean, I have a general idea, but It just can't be accurate, especially when you're looking back. The best nutrition studies measure it going forward,
Yeah.
and that's what we're seeing more and more.
But I mean, just to comment on this, I personally have to say, when I look back, having grown up in a small town in southern Germany in the Alps, um, I pretty much remember what I mean. The diet was not as complicated as it is now. It was just like basically a lot what you said about Italy. There was tradition. You don't eat meat on Fridays. You always have fish on Friday, and so there was a very strict both religious and cultural pattern. And there were these fermented foods. When as kids we had stomach aches, we're told to eat sauerkraut or brewer's yeast from the brewery. So even though in general, the German cuisine is not considered particularly healthy, but there were a lot of elements that when I look back, I remember exactly the dates when I ate those foods, even though it's a long time ago. And then also I remember when I came once as a foreign exchange student to the US, even though I was involved in high school sports pretty actively, I gained 15 pounds, and at the time I didn't know why, and this story has been told by many other friends of mine. When they came at a certain age to the US, they exploded from
Yeah.
because we loved hamburgers, we loved hot dogs, we loved all these things. So I can't remember these. It's kind of interesting, even though the food frequency questionnaires are not very accurate. But if you ask me, what did you eat when you were 15 years old or 20 years old? I know exactly what my
Yeah, because it was part of your culture and there weren't
yeah.
that many choices.
Something that has also intrigued me, and I've asked this question to several people. So I know people, patients that, so these were all students that came to me with gluten intolerance, sort of kind of an epidemic in the US. I still have not made up my mind if that is truly something real biologically, because you can't really find biological markers, even on biopsies, or if it's something that has been, that fear of gluten-containing food has been instilled, or if gluten-containing food also contains so many other bad things in highly processed foods. But so these patients came and said when they ate anything with gluten in it, they couldn't eat anything because they would get stomach upset and all kinds of symptoms. So then they went on a foreign exchange year to Italy. And they said from day one, they were able to eat anything on pasta, pizzas, bread without any symptoms at all. And when they came back, within a week, the symptoms came back. And so, have you heard this? And what do you, in your opinion, what's the reason for that? Is there something
Yeah,
fundamental?
I see this every single time I take a group to Italy. I hear it every single time. There's always someone gluten sensitive in the group. Celiac disease, of course, is something
Yeah, that's
separate.
different. That's different.
Yeah, if you have celiac, you have celiac. It doesn't matter where on earth you're eating. You can't have any wheat or wheat products. But the allergic and sensitized amongst us, when you go to a place like Italy, where the wheat is different, people find that they can eat pasta, they can eat pizza, they can eat the bread, and they don't have any of the symptoms before. It's so common. And I think one of the things that's going on, and no one knows for sure, right? But because it's multifactorial, like you said, most of the wheat that Americans eat is in the form of all-purpose white flour.
Yeah.
Like 94% of what Americans eat that's considered like a grain is
Mhm.
all-purpose white flour, which is a highly refined processed food that has no nutrients, it's devoid of nutrients and fiber. So there's nothing in it that's good, number
Mhm.
one. So it's junky. So you go over there and the flour is different. The wheat is different. There's a place in Sicily where we do a field trip. It's a farmer who grows ancient grains, and there's a seed bank in Sicily where they are protecting these older varieties of wheat. And he has an incredible display of 14 varieties of wheat, okay? And they have not been hybridized, meaning they haven't been mixed with any other forms of wheat to make them stand up taller or have longer roots or other things that have been done to these plants to make them more resistant to the elements, resistant to pests, more amenable to pesticides, things like that. So they are like, they're short, and they have deep roots, and it's a different kind of wheat entirely.
Mm.
So you can certainly get junk food wheat products in Italy too, just like everywhere. But if you're eating in smaller towns or smaller places and staying away from tourist places, most likely you're getting a very high quality durum wheat that is grown locally, or at least grown in Sicily, which used to be considered the breadbasket of Italy. And I think it's less allergenic. I think it's like, for lack of a better word, I think it's less likely to cause inflammation in people that are sensitive to that. And I see it over and over. Plus, the quality of the other ingredients to go with it are very high. So it's a really pleasant thing for people that can't eat pizza or pasta. And they can take that back home with them. There are a lot of Italian brands of pasta where the first ingredient is 100% durum wheat.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so that might be a pasta that one could cook at home, even if they're not in Italy, and get the same results.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, there's another aspect too, and I don't know, I've actually never thought about this, if this applies to wheat as well. I mean, the whole phenomenon of the chemical agriculture that we have in the US, that there's this um, wouldn't is it's essentially it's all chemical fertilizers that are being used, which suppress or get rid of the natural microbiome within the soil.
Hmm.
And those microbes play a big role in interacting with the plants for the plants to produce certain things, like uh,
Hmm.
polyphenols and I just wonder if that could have an influence as well. And so my question to you is, do you know if some of these places in Sicily, do they use natural fertilizer, or what's now called regenerative organic agriculture in the US, or do they use the same chemical fertilizers there that are being used everywhere else?
I think you find in Sicily that they're predominantly smaller farms, less big ag, and a move towards regenerative agriculture and a real pride in, growing things without chemicals and pesticides. That's sort of the European tradition. Europeans have always been skeptical
Yeah.
of these ways to make things grow faster. And in Sicily, or my farmer friend, I was telling you about Giuseppe, he told the story how the pesticide companies came calling in Sicily to all the small farmers and tried to sell them,
Mm.
this whole system that would help them grow more grain, have to work less at it. And, basically everyone would be rich. They'd be making more money than before. And some farmers went for it. Other farmers decided to stick with the old ways. In general, everyone's trying to go back to the regenerative ways, whether it's organic or biodynamic or fully regenerative. That is the trend, and that's how most things are grown.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, I recently was at a meeting, invited a meeting in Zurich, Switzerland, um, called From Soil to Soul. And it was all these young regenerative organic farmers that basically, have this organization. And it was wonderful to see that enthusiasm amongst young people, to get back to that kind of agriculture.
There's a real movement. And, I think that what you're saying, there's so much truth to the fact that, part of the problem in the US with our food is the soil. The soil is devoid of nutrients. I might make myself a beautiful salad with carrots and parsnips or whatever I find at the grocery store. But, if I'm being honest with myself, these vegetables are probably not as nutrient dense as they were 5 or 10 years ago,
Yeah.
certainly not 20 years ago, because the soil has been declining over time. If you look at mushrooms, like mushrooms are a really important food source to look at in terms of brain health, right? And mushrooms have two things that you don't get from most other foods that are really important for brain health: ergothioneine and theanine. These
Mhm.
two nutrients. These nutrients come from the soil. And so
Yeah.
it's like literally like our only food source of these nutrients. And the fungi get them from the soil and bring it up through their roots. And consuming mushrooms in northern Italy, especially the types of mushrooms that are foraged for, like porcini, which are especially nutrient dense in these nutrients, they have been associated with reduced dementia risk in older populations by as much as 40%.
Mm.
And so if you think about a mushroom in the United States, unless you're foraging it for yourself, which I love to do in Jackson Hole, we actually have wild mushrooms. That's one of my favorite things to do is hunt for morels and chanterelles and sometimes porcini if we're lucky. But mostly we're getting them at the grocery store, right? Or
Yeah.
at the farmer's market if we're lucky. And they're only as good as the soil they're grown in.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've almost come to the end of our conversation. It's too bad. I mean, I hope we'll have more opportunities to
Oh, I
continue.
would love that. We could talk about these topics for a long time.
So one last question, a personal question. So out of the and I should show you your book one more time here. Um,
Oh, thanks.
um,
So the
out,
Brain Health Kitchen came out last year, and it's a cookbook. It's a manual for brain health, but it's basically a cookbook, and each chapter covers one of the 10 brain healthy food groups.
so out of these 100 recipes that are in in this book, which one is your favorite?
Which one is my favorite? I don't know. They all had to be my favorite because I had to test these recipes so many times when I was making this book. And so they not only had to be my favorites, but also my family's favorites. Um, but gosh, what is one thing that I make all the time? One thing I make weekly is there's a condiment called walnut parm. And this is great. It contains one of my favorite fermented foods, miso paste. And I created the walnut parm as a way to get my students in my cooking school to eat more walnuts because walnuts are so good for you and they've got so many brain health nutrients. And so it's basically walnuts, garlic, nutritional yeast, which is like a shot of vitamin B12, and miso paste. And it comes together in a food processor or a blender into this crumbly topping that tastes remarkably like Parmesan cheese. Not that there's
Oh,
anything wrong with Parmesan cheese, and not that you would ever want to actually replace it, but walnut parm is actually a way to eat more walnuts. A lot of people in the US are not in the habit of using, nuts and seeds as much as these Mediterranean cultures.
yeah.
So walnut parm can be a topping on a salad. It can be a topping on roasted vegetables. You can toss it with pasta. You can toss it with zucchini noodles. There's all sorts of things that I do with it. So that's one of my favorite things that came out of that process.
Well, thanks for sharing this and thanks for the conversation. It was really wonderful. And as I said, I can only recommend your book and probably also your workshops, which I've not experienced myself, but it sounds wonderful to get.
Oh, you have to come with us sometime. Yeah, we'll be going to Sardinia in the spring, Puglia in the spring, Costa Rica, and I haven't announced it yet, but I'll have a Sardinia trip in the fall of 2025. So I'll announce that soon in my newsletter.
Okay, thanks, Annie.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.